Well, it's actually happening. The world's largest roller coaster is nearing completion. A ride that, quite frankly, I thought would never happen. Ever since its conception back in 2019, everyone thought this ride, this park, it was all a big joke. It seemed impossible for Six Flags Qiddiya to ever be constructed, but here we are almost 5 years later, and I am eating my words. Falcon's Flight, it's real, it's here, and it will be the largest roller coaster that has ever existed. To get an idea of how enormous this roller coaster is, keep in mind that Steel Dragon 2000, the longest coaster, is 8,133 feet. Formula Rosa is 149 miles per hour, and the current tallest coaster, King Ka, is 456 feet, which is still almost 200 feet shorter than Falcon's Flight. For a closer representation on the scale of Falcon's Flight, just imagine the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. That has a height of 630 feet. Falcon's Flight is, again, 640 feet. However, there is a caveat to this number because it does refer to the peak along the gorge wall of the coaster, not the actual archway for the ride. That has a height of 524 feet, which is about 100 feet shorter than the arch in St. Louis. But still, it's nothing to sneeze at. Similarly to the arch in St. Louis, which is a gateway to the west in the United States, the arch of Falcon's Flight is a gateway to unimmaculate amounts of innovation and thrills. Now, if I wanted to, I could go on and on about the sheer magnitude of this coaster. But I'm going to try to stray away from that rabbit hole because anything I can say about Falcon's Flight's scope can easily be revealed by just looking at the ride. No, instead I'm gonna change paths a little bit and talk about the most crucial aspect about the ride, the main reason why this attraction will never be replicated, why this coaster will just be a one and done, and that reason is capital. As you know, this coaster, it wasn't built for pennies on the dollar. It cost an insane amount of wealth for this project to become a reality. How much? Well, that's what I'm going to try to find out. I'm going to attempt to discover how much money it takes to build the largest coaster on the planet. Now, when I dreamt up this thought experiment, there were a few issues that I had to overcome. For one, how would I even find the price tag? Six Flags Qiddiya, they're not as open with their finances like some other parks. So in order to get a final number for the ride, I might have to be a little creative. So I thought, what if I find an already existing attraction from the same manufacturer as Falcon's Flight, and I work my way from there to find the answer. So let's dig around a little bit. The manufacturer of Falcon's Flight I will be referring to will be Intamin Amusement Rides. They are a very established company in the roller coaster industry, so there had to be a similar ride in their portfolio that I can examine. Now keep in mind, Intamin, they classify Falcon's Flight as an exocoaster, and unsurprisingly, this is the one and only of its kind, so I can't look at a different one for reference. But they have made a lot of rides along the same stature, so I decided to choose their Giga Coaster model, specifically I-305 at King's Dominion. If you're wondering why this ride in particular, it's the closest thing I can compare to Falcon's Flight in principle at least. For one, it's a tall ride that maintains its speed through low-to-the-ground transitions. The ride has a double-spined track, so it can maintain static determinants during high forces, and it's about on par with the intensity I expect from Falcon's Flight. Now, I-305 wasn't my first choice. I wanted Velocicoaster. However, the number for that ride was too inflated from all the theming, and if not that, I wanted to pick a ride that was geographically closer to Falcon's Flight, like Formula Rosa or Flying Aces at Ferrari World, just so I wouldn't have to worry too much about the conversion rate between US denomination and Saudi Riyal, since Saudi Riyal and UAE Dirham is about the same in value. But once again, these Arab parks, they're not too open with their finances, so I'm just going to leave the conversion rates out of my calculations and strictly leave it in US denomination because that's what I'm familiar with. Either way, I'm establishing I-305 as our main catalyst to find the price tag. How will I do this? Well, I'm going to do a method called price per track ratio, meaning I'm going to take the overall price of I-305, $25 million, and I'm going to divide it by the track length of I-305, 5,100 feet. That way I get a ratio of cost per foot. Of course, this will not be one for one, obviously. I-305 and Falcon's flight are two very different rides. For one, Falcon has LSM launches, while I-305 just has a cable lift, and Falcon uses the terrain more compared to 305 where it sits on flat ground. All variables that should affect the price, but is too unclear to find out. So I'll just try to account for all these factors in the standard deviation at the end. But when we get back to the calculation, we get a total dollar per track ratio of $4,902. So if we multiply the cost of the track by the length of Falcon's flight, 13,944 feet, according to RCDB, we get a final number of $68,353,488. A huge amount, sure, but we're not done. Keep in mind, I-305 opened in 2010, so our initial cost of $25 million that we adjusted is not accurate. There's a little thing known as inflation, meaning the value of a dollar from 2010 isn't the same as a dollar in 2024. If you're not too familiar with economics, don't worry, I'll quickly explain it. Inflation, in simple terms, is the expansion of the money supply. So the more money that exists in your currency, the less valuable each dollar will be worth. And trust me, in the last 14 years, the amount of dollars that existed now than before is a lot. So for a more accurate number, I have to adjust the time value of money of the $68 million figure and move it to a present day value. So when looking at the $68 million, I'm gonna call that 2008 money. If you're wondering why I'm not calling 2010 money, because that's the year I-305 opened. That's not when they bought the ride. Remember, roller coasters, they take a few years to develop, so I'm moving the value back to when King's Dominion probably bought the ride. But when I move the $68 million to, let's say, 2022 money, we get a new inflation total of a whopping $92,910,874. Jesus. Now, this is calculated with an inflation rate of 35.9% over the last 14 years from 2008 to 2022. This number was grabbed by a few inflation calculators, but you get roughly the same number either way. You may now think this is the final number, but nope. This was just to adjust for the extra dollars in the economy. We still haven't even talked about price of steel. Like any good product nowadays, the prices keep going up. And that also goes for the materials going into a product. Steel, unsurprisingly, over the last 14 years, has seen its fair share of up and downs, mostly going up. Not just as a byproduct of inflation, but also material shortages, labor shortages, higher demand. All reasons to why roller coasters will become more expensive because steel is hurting the manufacturer's margins. When looking at the average price of all steel and iron, provided by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we've seen from at least October 2008 till October 2022, the average price of steel has almost doubled in value. Even if we account for the fact that not all steel is made equally, some is more expensive to produce than others, since steel is a combination of iron and carbon, with a potential of mixing iron with other alloys like chromium, along with how there are different methods to adjust the strength of steel by looking at phase diagrams, but I don't want to get into that, it's too complicated. There's not a lot of information on what kind of steel Intamin uses. I can probably make a close guess. However, it's easier taking the average increase for all steel. So, with that being said, if I make these new modifications to the overall cost of around $93 million, specifically around 80% of that, because despite steel changing the overall cost, it's not going to affect the entire figure. There are other expenses besides the production of steel. But after this new modification, I get a final grand total of, drumroll please, $167,834,203. So after adjusting for inflation, after accounting for steel increases, this is the final total. Now, if I wanted to, I could theoretically adjust the price even more to account for minor things that might inflate the price. Like if I accounted for the tariffs for the import cost of steel, which is around 5 to 10%, and that would give me a new grand total of around $175 million, with a standard deviation of around plus or minus $37 million to account for any errors or variables in my calculations that I couldn't figure out. But with that being said, this is my conservative price estimate of what I think Falcon's flight should have costed. But still, I could very well be completely wrong. The price of Falcon's flight could have very well been double what I predicted, and we would never know that. In case you forgot, Six Flags Qiddiya isn't being funded by Six Flags. No, all the capital for this coaster, for this park, is by the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which is a public enterprise owned by the government. So the government of Saudi Arabia is paying for everything. And when the government's your primary buyer, I wouldn't be surprised if Intamin underhandedly jacked up the price just to make more of a profit. And I don't blame them. Saudi Arabia, they're investing in a ton of projects for their country, all in an effort to increase tourism. You think dropping $175 or even $350 million on a single roller coaster is a big investment for them? No. Despite how colossal this ride is, being the largest ride in existence, it is nothing more than a drop in the bucket for Saudi Arabia. Think about every other project the country is doing, like The Line, The Cube, concepts that cost between $800 billion and $1.2 trillion to achieve. When you compare Falcon's flight to that, suddenly $350 mil doesn't sound like a lot. I'm just happy Falcon's flight is actually happening. Because a country with so many ambitious undertakings, I wouldn't be surprised if some got cancelled, they get delayed, or they just fail. Saudi Arabia seems to just be throwing stuff at the wall to see what might work for tourism. And most of the time, that's not the best strategy. Look at a lot of canceled projects in like Dubai, or hell, just focus on Saudi's own failed project, the Jeddah Tower. What was supposed to be the tallest building in the world is just dormant. They only got a fourth of the way done with it, then paused for 6 years. So I think you can forgive people for doubting if this ride would ever happen. But now that we're about a year from the park opening, I just hope the whole thing won't close immediately in 5 to 10 years. Because to reiterate, building a park because it seemed cool rather than having the free market decide isn't the best recipe for success. But I suppose that's a topic for another video.